The missile war gets the headlines, the ballistic strikes, the oil refineries burning, the bunkers, the body counts. That is the war everyone is watching. But in the middle of all that destruction, a senior Iranian official quietly told CNN something that should be getting far more attention than it is. Iran is willing to open the Strait of Hormuz, not because of Trump's threats, not because of American warships, not because of bunker buster bombs dropped on Iran's coastline. Iran is willing to open the strait on one condition. You want your tanker through, pay in Chinese yuan. That single sentence, buried under the noise of missile counts and casualty figures, is the most consequential thing to come out of this war, because it is not just an energy policy. It is a direct attack on the financial system that has underwritten American global power for more than 50 years, and the infrastructure to make it work was already built, waiting for exactly this moment. Over the next several minutes, I'm going to show you what this offer actually means, why it is more dangerous to Washington than any ballistic missile, and why China did not need to fire a single shot to be the most important player in this entire war. Here is where it started. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched joint strikes on Iran under Operation Epic Fury. The supreme leader was killed. The IRGC command structure took direct hits. More than 2,000 strikes were conducted in the opening days across at least 26 of Iran's 31 provinces. The White House projected 4 to 6 weeks to achieve its stated objectives. Within 72 hours of the war starting, Iran answered with a move that no amount of bombing could undo. It announced the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. 20 million barrels of oil pass through that 33-kilometer-wide choke point every single day. That is roughly 20% of global petroleum consumption, moving through a waterway where Iran controls the entire northern shore. By March 1st, tanker traffic had collapsed. Hundreds of vessels sat anchored outside the strait, unable or unwilling to cross. War risk insurance through the corridor became effectively prohibitive. Brent crude climbed from around $73 a barrel before the war to over $114 in the weeks that followed. Goldman Sachs warned that elevated prices could persist through 2027. But here is what the White House did not account for. Iran did not close the strait uniformly. Iranian-flagged vessels kept moving. Chinese-owned tankers kept moving. Ships from Pakistan, from India after direct negotiations with Tehran, and from Turkey also transited. This was not a blockade. It was a permission system, and the condition for permission was becoming clearer by the day. A senior Iranian official confirmed to CNN what the tanker tracking data had already been showing. Iran is willing to allow oil passage through the Strait of Hormuz on the condition that the cargo is traded in Chinese yuan. Between February 28th and mid-March, between 11.7 and 16.5 million barrels of Iranian crude had transited to China via shadow fleet under IRGC protection. While every other nation's shipping sat locked out, China was paying in yuan. China's tankers were moving freely. The architecture for a parallel yuan-denominated energy corridor was not being proposed. It was already operating. The official statement from Tehran was simply formalizing the criteria. To understand why that matters, you need to understand what the petrodollar system actually is and why every American president since Richard Nixon has treated its preservation as a core national security interest. In August 1971, Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility to gold, dismantling the Bretton Woods system that had governed global finance since World War II. The dollar became a fiat currency with no physical backing whatsoever. Washington needed a new mechanism to guarantee global demand for its currency. The opportunity came from a crisis. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War triggered an Arab oil embargo that sent prices quadrupling from around $3 to nearly $12 a barrel. The political fallout created a window for a deal that would reshape the global economy for the next half-century. In July 1974, Treasury Secretary William Simon flew to Riyadh. The deal that emerged was straightforward and transformative. Saudi Arabia agreed to price its oil exclusively in US dollars and to recycle surplus oil revenues into American Treasury bonds. In return, Washington provided military protection and arms sales. OPEC followed Riyadh's lead. From that point forward, any country on earth that wanted to buy oil had to first acquire dollars. It did not matter whether you were Japan, Germany, India, or Brazil. Oil ran the world. Oil was priced in dollars, so the world ran on dollars. The consequences were enormous. Permanent global demand for American currency was baked into the structure of world trade. The United States gained the ability to run persistent trade deficits without the usual currency collapse. American interest rates stayed lower because foreign governments had to park their dollar surpluses somewhere, and U.S. Treasury bonds were the obvious destination. Washington acquired an unmatched tool for economic coercion through dollar-denominated sanctions. Cutting a country off from the dollar system was not just a financial penalty, it was a severing from the global economy itself. That is the system Iran's Yuan offer is targeting, not with missiles, with a settlement currency. Now look at who benefits from this more than anyone else, and who has been quietly preparing for this exact scenario for years. China imports more crude oil than any other country on Earth. In 2025, Chinese oil imports hit a record 11.55 million barrels per day. More than 55% of that oil came from the Middle East, and roughly 45 to 50% of all Chinese crude imports transited the Strait of Hormuz. China receives 37.7% of all oil flowing through Hormuz, the single largest share of any country in the world. India is second at 14.7%. The United States receives just 2.5%. For decades, this meant China had a fundamental strategic problem. To buy the energy that runs its factories, its transportation networks, and its power grid, China had to first acquire dollars from a rival nation that had demonstrated a clear willingness to use the financial system as a weapon. After Russia's banks were cut off from SWIFT in 2022, Beijing received the message clearly and without ambiguity. Dollar dependency was a loaded gun pointed directly at the Chinese economy. So China spent years building an alternative plumbing system, quietly, methodically, and without press conferences. In March 2018, China launched the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, allowing oil futures contracts to be bought and sold in Yuan for the first time in history. The contracts were called the Petro-Yuan, and Western analysts mostly dismissed them as symbolic and inconsequential. In 2015, the People's Bank of China had already launched the cross-border interbank payment system, known as CIPS, a settlement network for yuan-denominated international transactions that would allow payments to clear without passing through American correspondent banks or the SWIFT messaging network. In 2024, CIPS processed 8.22 million transactions, totaling the equivalent of roughly 24.5 trillion US dollars, a 42.6% increase from the previous year. By early 2026, CIPS had been updated with new rules for the first time in 8 years, expanding its mandate beyond yuan-only transactions and opening the door to processing payments in other currencies as well. The network now covers more than 4,900 banking institutions across 189 countries around the world. This is the infrastructure Iran is weaponizing. A payment routed through CIPS between two banks does not pass through U.S. correspondent banks. It does not touch the SWIFT network. It does not expose the transaction to American financial jurisdiction in any way. A country that buys oil through CIPS in yuan is, for the purposes of that transaction, completely invisible to the sanctions architecture Washington has built and maintained over the last 50 years. China did not build this to defeat the petrodollar overnight. The yuan is still only about 2% of global foreign exchange reserves compared to the dollar's 57%. SWIFT data still shows the dollar accounting for roughly 48% of global payments versus the yuan's 3%. China understood it did not need to replace the dollar's dominance globally. It needed to build an alternative corridor, functional and credible, ready for the moment when the right crisis arrived. The Strait of Hormuz effectively closed to Western shipping and quietly opened to yuan-denominated trade is that moment. The mechanism Iran is describing would create what analysts at European Business Magazine called a bifurcated global oil market, UN-denominated barrels flowing through Hormuz for those willing to pay in China's currency, dollar-denominated barrels rerouted around the strait at significant additional cost and time for those who are not. The war premium Western energy importers are already absorbing from elevated oil prices would become structural rather than temporary. Every week, the strait stays functionally closed to dollar-settled trade. That structural premium grows larger and more entrenched. The logic for Asian buyers is particularly stark. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and India collectively receive around 38% of all Hormuz oil flows. In 2025, around 78% of all Middle Eastern crude oil exports to those four economies flowed through the strait. They are running on finite reserves. Japan holds roughly 350 million barrels in onshore storage, enough for around 150 days. South Korea and Taiwan hold less. India negotiated safe passage for 2 gas tankers after direct government-to-government talks with Tehran. New Delhi did not go through Washington. It called Iran directly. That is not a minor detail. That is the geopolitical order shifting in real time. Iran has framed the Yuan condition publicly as a war measure, as a way to manage oil flows and maintain pressure on Washington. But the analysts who have looked most carefully at the offer see something far longer term embedded in it. By insisting on Yuan settlement at the world's single most critical maritime choke point, Tehran is inviting China into the region as a financial stakeholder with a direct interest in maintaining this new settlement architecture even after the war ends. It is offering Beijing the one thing that years of diplomatic engagement and Belt and Road infrastructure loans could not fully deliver: a permanent stake in how Gulf energy is priced and settled. China has reacted publicly with caution. Chinese analysts cited in the South China Morning Post warned of implementation challenges and the risk of straining U.S.-China relations further. Beijing is walking a careful line. It wants the Yuan corridor without the formal confrontation. But the tankers are already moving. The payments in Yuan are already clearing through CIPS. The cautious public statements from Beijing have not stopped the shadow fleet from operating or the Yuan-denominated trades from settling. Washington's response has been to focus almost entirely on the military dimension of the strait closure, the warships, the bunker buster bombs, the anti-ship missile sites. On Saturday, March 22nd, Trump issued a 48-hour ultimatum on Truth Social, warning Iran that it must fully open the strait or he would, in his words, obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest one first. Iran responded that any attack on its energy infrastructure would trigger retaliatory strikes on all U.S. and Israeli energy facilities across the region, and that the strait would be closed indefinitely until destroyed plants were rebuilt. As of Monday, March 23rd, Trump had delayed the deadline by 5 days, citing what he called productive talks. The strait remained effectively closed to Western commercial shipping. Trump's ultimatum frames the entire problem as a military one with a military solution: open the strait or face bombs. But the Yuan payment condition is not addressed in any of those statements. There is no obvious military response to a settlement currency offer. You cannot bomb an interbank payment system. You cannot sink a ship that is paying in the wrong currency. The only real counter to Iran's financial offer is to make the dollar system more attractive, less coercive, and more reliable for the countries being asked to choose between them. That is not a 48-hour timeline problem. That is a generational reckoning with decades of accumulated structural dependency. The deeper numbers suggest the dollar's structural position was already eroding before a single bomb dropped in this war. According to IMF data, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves fell from its peak of 72% in 2001 to around 57% by early 2025. That is a 15 percentage point decline over 2 decades, driven by a quiet but deliberate diversification across dozens of central banks, adding euros, Australian dollars, Canadian dollars, and yes, yuan to their reserve portfolios. China cut its U.S. Treasury holdings by more than 45% from their peak, from over $1.3 trillion in 2013 to under $731 billion by mid-2025, while simultaneously buying gold for 11 consecutive months through September 2025. The world's central banks added more than 1,000 tons of gold to their reserves in 2024 alone. The trend was gradual enough that Washington could characterize it as manageable, as a slow drift, rather than an alarm. What Iran is offering the world from its position on the northern shore of the Strait of Hormuz is not gradual. It is a forced binary choice made urgent by $114 a barrel oil and ships that have no route home. Pay in yuan, move freely. Continue in dollars, stay anchored outside the choke point. That is what makes this the most consequential single development of this entire conflict. Every other Iranian military action in this war, the ballistic missiles, the cluster munitions, the drone swarms, requires Iran to expend finite resources and accept the risk of American countermeasures. The yuan payment condition costs Iran nothing to maintain. It requires no missiles. It leaves no wreckage. It creates no targeting coordinates for U.S. surveillance drones. It simply redirects which currency's clearing system processes the next oil tanker's payment, and in doing so, rewrites a piece of the financial architecture that has sustained American global influence since Henry Kissinger was flying to Saudi Arabia in 1974. China did not fire a single missile in this war. It did not need to. The conflict that the United States launched to demonstrate dominance is doing China's financial work for it, at American expense, on an American timeline. With American fuel costs rising every single day, the strait stays closed. Whether Iran's yuan offer ultimately reshapes global oil pricing in any durable way depends on factors that neither side can fully control. Whether other Gulf producers move in the same direction, whether Asian buyers are willing to institutionalize yuan settlement beyond crisis conditions, whether the yuan can develop the market depth and institutional trust that sustains a reserve currency over decades. These are legitimate questions with genuinely uncertain answers. What is not uncertain is that the offer has been made. The payments corridor is already functioning. Countries from India to Turkey to Italy and France have been quietly negotiating passage terms directly with Tehran rather than following Washington's lead. The permission choke point is open. The negotiating position is intact, and the condition, pay in yuan or face continued closure, has not been taken off the table. A war that was launched to project American power may end up accelerating the erosion of the financial architecture on which that power depends. That is not a secondary story buried beneath the missile counts and the casualty figures. That is the story. That is the only story that will matter 5 years from now when historians sit down to explain what this war actually changed and what it cost the nation that started it.